Started. Dear honorable guests, it's my pleasure to welcome you to our panel titled Decolonizing Public Health in History. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you to our event with two distinguished colleagues who will be the panelists in this session together with me. As you may know, right now, this week is the Global Public Health Week, organized by World Federation of Public Health Associations. And the aim of the event, at least this year, is to focus on equity in public health. So the discussions will be centered on decolonizing public health practices in order to address historical and systemic inequities. And the aim of the focus is to promote, obviously, public health equity by recognizing diverse cultural and social contexts, and also to reimagine global health strategies to build a fairer, healthier future. And you will be seeing today three historians who will be trying to contribute in these pressing issues on modern public health and how to decolonize it. As we start to our panel, I would like to obviously start with the Australian acknowledgement of the land. I am joining this meeting from the traditional lands of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to the Bunurong peoples of the nation as the original and ongoing owners and custodians of these beautiful lands. If you are joining us from abroad, you might not know, but the history of Indigenous Australians stretch back to 75,000 years deep in history, the oldest continuous civilization on Earth, which has a lot of lessons for us, I guess, in terms of sustainability as well. So I stand in solidarity with Indigenous peoples for reconciliation and justice for all Indigenous communities globally. And I guess this panel is part of that broader commitment that I share with my distinguished colleagues as well. And as I mentioned that I'm joining you from the traditional lands of the Kulin Nation, please use the chat to let us know where you are joining us as well. Maybe as well as a couple of words on your field of expertise, for example. It will be wonderful. So the three historians that you see in this panel are joined in 2022 through a project that has been spearheaded by Professor Guy Geltner. The name of the research project is Pursuing Public Health in the Pre-Industrial World, 1100 to 1800. This is an ARC-funded discovery project that will be running until the end of the next year. And through that project, I personally was able to learn more about the fields of expertise of not only Guy, but also a distinguished and highly interdisciplinary group of researchers. Some of them are in India, some of them are in Italy, and they work on different fields ranging from social history to archaeology. And that project will be, I guess, the starting point for this panel to think about how our research on pre-industrial, pre-colonial, maybe pre-modern world can help us to think about public health in decolonized ways. To briefly introduce my colleagues first and foremost, I will start with Dr. Shireen Hamza. Shireen earned her PhD from Harvard University in the history of science in 2023, and she is currently a postdoctoral fellow in Northwestern University. Her field of specialization is history of science and technology with a focus on the Islamic world. And her current research is on the role of Muslim scholars, ulama, in group prophylaxis, in group prevention of illnesses, and the history of public bathing in particular. And the second panelist is Professor Guy Geltner, who is a professor of history at Monash University. He's a well-known social and environmental historian, and his current research focuses on public health practices of miners in particular, and their management of the environment with a specific emphasis on southern Italy between the years 1100s and 1550. Last but not least, so myself, my name is Aydogan. I am also a member of the Department of History at Monash University. I'm a religionist. My field of specialization is medieval Islamic intellectual history. And my current research focuses on a popular literature on piety and medicine known as prophetic medicine literature. So hopefully, maybe we will start with briefly thinking about or talking about our research project that brings us those three historians together. And maybe for that aim, I can leave the floor to the chief researcher in this project, Professor Geltner. Dear Guy, can you explain us what is the project that brings us, the three people in this room, together? And secondly, in your research in the last decade, I think, you began to use a neologism, as far as I see, that you have introduced to scholarship, which is the notion of healthscaping. What is healthscaping, and how can healthscaping help us to think about the pre-modern history of health?
Thank you, Aydogan, and thank you everyone for joining us. I'm just making sure that is there any lever by which we're supposed to allow other people to join, or people just have the link that, okay, good.
I think, yeah, I don't think there's a meeting room, waiting room right now.
Yes, people
okay.
can join, exactly, yes.
Great, fantastic. Well, to start in a way at the beginning, healthscaping, actually, I did not coin the term, but I think I and the research teams I've been involved with over the last decade have certainly adapted and popularized it. It was used in the 80s in some sort of, I think, a clinic design context, and like waiting rooms or things like that. And where I first came across the term was in a very famous book in public health policy called Prescription for a Healthy Nation, co-written by Deborah Cohen and Tom Farley, who was then the public health portfolio holder for New York City. So for those of you who are aware of what's happening in the East Coast, in the aughts, getting rid of salt, getting rid of the big gulps, getting rid of the cessation of smoking in restaurants, public area. He's the guy behind that. He was hired by Mayor Bloomberg at the time, and worked in the CDC before, and so on. I've been in touch with them sort of to ask. It was a heading of a section in the book. And Tom Farley told me at the time that he was doing a lot of gardening, and so that concept organically came to him. But the publishers, I think it was Beacon, put the kibosh on using that teeth-breaking term in any sort of title, any sort of publicity material. But we've taken it on since then, and in a nutshell, Aydogan, the way they define it in the book is a very kind of broad sense, is designing environments where health can bloom. And I thought, okay, that's a very broad way, and it also has a sense of like spatial interventions. They were very much a kind of to some extent interested in approaches to urbanism that I at least associate with Jane Jacobs and Eyes on the Street, and things that are not about segregating spaces, but having community participation, taking responsibility for what is going on and how to improve health outcomes. And I thought that was a broad path, a sort of ecumenical big tent that under which we especially as pre-modern historians can put or can integrate and can examine interventions meant to improve health and well-being more broadly that don't fall under or don't seem as evident precursors to modern preventative health and prophylactic measures. All of this, mind you, was 6 or 7 years before COVID hit. And as we were gathering information about a lot of these community-based preventative practices, quarantine, prayers, market regulation, ringing bells or not, quality of produce, and waste practices of waste disposal, and so on and so forth, we didn't realize how relevant some of these quote unquote low-tech measures are going to be for the better part of the population of the globe among us. So in a way, around 2020, when I moved to Australia, the pendulum swung very widely in our direction, as it were, when it became very obvious that a lot of people were working very hard on developing a vaccine, that these low-tech preventative measures are not making life great for people, of course, but being widely used and being very effective in saving lives. So the project got a lot of attention, and then we started this phase of the project, which I think leads a bit more directly to the topic of decolonization. The previous project was based on cities in the Middle Ages, mainly Northern Italian and Low Country cities, so the most urbanized areas of the globe or of Europe at that point, of course, not of the globe. And in a kind of a awakening that we had in that project, we decided to test the waters also a bit more globally, and at least in part, leave the urban space, which in many respects is not typical certainly not of Europe at that point. Hence, the warm and nicely reciprocated invitation for you, Aydogan, to join us, for Shireen to join us, and other colleagues working on India and on the Middle East, while keeping a foothold in Europe in the form of minors, because we really wanted to see to integrate rural communities as opposed to just urban communities or people who pass through the countryside, whether they are pilgrims, merchants, travelers, armies, courts, and so forth. So that's where we are right now, and maybe it's time to, conclude on that front. And I'd like to use today to explore how this part of the project and other aspects of it can help us think about what it means to decolonize health history from a historical perspective, and especially coming from the pre-modern world, as it were.
Excellent. And I think in a couple of your writings, dear Guy, you mentioned that there is this popular notion that the medieval times is the 1000th year without any bath, right? So the times that were ugly and violent and people didn't care about health. A famous scene many of you might not remember from the Pulp Fiction, where our guy says that I'm gonna get medieval on your ass, right? Or the recent newspapers about Gaza hospitals say that, all hospitals are bombed, so Gaza is in medieval condition. So medieval is the time actually when there is absolutely no health-related, awareness even in people. And that gives us a very distinctly Eurocentric notion of modernity. So the modern is not just only something much more superior as a break, but also it creates certain hierarchies where it's the product of the Europeans automatically becoming affiliated with this narratives of moral supremacy. And I guess that the project that you are spearheading is in many ways kind of challenging that, but not only showing the continuities between modern and the pre-modern, but also globalizing it by showing that the modern that we know as today is not just only a European product, but the product of a global enterprise. This is how I read the project. Yes, go ahead.
Absolutely. If I can add that just to plant a seed for a future discussion, is that the way, and I put in the quote is from Jules Michelet, is a French historian about medieval Europe being 1,000 years without a bath. It's also, as you just exactly demonstrated, Aydogan, is that the Middle Ages is the ultimate civilizational other. And so anytime we're using the Middle Ages, which is of course a modern or a Renaissance term, not a term people at the time used about themselves,
Hmm.
it's the perfect paradigm to put civilizations today that are, as it were, out of sync with the modernizing project or of the civilization of Western, usually civilization. So in other um, civilizations use the Middle Ages in different ways, but in the West, something medieval, unless you're a small minority, is usually something out of sync with civilization, something that we've overcome. It's a way to cast an aspersion on a community. So if Gaza is medieval or ISIS is medieval, or by the
Hmm.
way, until 100 years ago, Russia was medieval.
Hmm.
You know, it's a moving target
Absolutely.
rather than, like you said, seeing the continuities rather than the changes. So that's what we're trying to have a more honest conversation about as well.
Yeah, and this is exactly why I have been learning a lot from this project, from each project member. It's been very, very valuable for me too. To maybe to look at specifics, maybe starting with you, dear Shireen, if you don't mind. So within this framework, that is say, trying to decolonize our ways of looking at the history as well. Can you a little bit introduce us, dear Shireen, specifically what you do within this broader project on the history of pre-modern public health? And what is the kind of what are the problems that your research focuses on in terms of the history of public health? Starting with you, then Guy, then maybe I can just briefly introduce what we do within this framework of challenging the medieval times as the 1,000 year without a bath.
Absolutely. Thank you, Aydogan and Guy. And I didn't get a chance to say it before, so I'll just mention briefly that I'm calling in today from Chicago, which are the traditional and unceded territories of the Council of Three Fires, the Anishinaabe, Potawatomi, and Ojibwe peoples, and also that Chicago is a really vibrant place for Indigenous life and has long been a crossroads of trade for many, many other nations and tribes in North America. And similar to the place that my people hail from, which is South Asia, more and more living here have I realized how the US-Canada border is also a partition that has divided a lot of peoples who have called this place home for many centuries. Um, so on that note, my work is actually very tied to my own history as someone whose ancestors hail from the Western Indian Ocean world. So I am a Gujarati Muslim origin person, and I'm gonna try just sharing my screen for a moment because if I have permission, I think I do. Um, to just show this region of the world for I know we have some people in the audience who are not historians and perhaps they might find it useful. Sorry, one moment, please. Just trying to figure this out. Yeah. Okay. So is there a map visible for you guys?
Yes,
A
we
Google
can see
map?
it. Yeah.
All right. So this just to zoom out, my work connects regions that today are considered very disconnected. The Middle East over here in the top left corner of the map, and then South Asia or India, Indian subcontinent over here. Um, but as you can see, there's this body of water connecting these regions, as well as East Africa and the Swahili coast. And in addition to that, there were monsoons, annual monsoons, to which Indian Ocean trade and travel was tied. And so, in looking at public health across this region, I often have to look both at Arabic texts as well as Persian texts. And with this group, I'm also looking beyond the text at certain spaces. And what I have found is that we can really move beyond when we look at spaces in the history of public health, some of the things that we've been talking about baths. Well, this region is dotted with baths that were built in the medieval period. Um, this region is dotted with wells, with riverside spaces that were invested with a lot of different kinds of meaning, and into which a lot of different kinds of labor was poured. And so, in looking at these spaces, I can't say, whether I'm looking at Egypt or Yemen, where I've traced networks of ulama living in this place called the Tihama Coast, where many, many people were kind of a bit more remote, many days of travel away from these kind of connected Indian Ocean ports like Aden that we always think about. And so in these remote regions, these more rural regions, we might say, although, most of the world's population did not live in cities at this point, so it didn't have the same connotation, we still have people pursuing health. And what survives of that are not only these kind of physical spaces, like we're talking about like hammams or bathhouses or like hospitals, but also many texts survive from this period. And through those texts, I try to recreate relationships that came out of a desire to study medical knowledge and make it available to the community. So some of the people who I've studied in this region of the Tihama were Muslim male scholars of Islam. They were not scholars of medicine, they were not physicians, but they recognized that there was a shortage of medical knowledge in their area and that there were many people in need of it. And over the course of several hundred years, many people wrote texts of medicine. And what motivated them was their relationships with their teachers. They wanted to finish the projects that were started by their teachers. They wanted to draw on the resources accumulated by their teachers. And I think often in the history of public health, we're not always thinking about devotion and love for one's teacher as a motivating factor for people to learn medical knowledge and make it available to a community. We also often aren't thinking about religious scholars, well, not this group, of course, but maybe, in other groups or in older modes of scholarship, people were more focused on, for example, religious scholars insofar as it had to do with the plague or it had to do with, debates around the use of tobacco when it was introduced, but not as much outside of those contexts of controversy or of catastrophe. So how did religious scholars play a role in safeguarding a community's health in an everyday way? So I'm going to pass it over to Guy here, and maybe later in the conversation, I'll talk about the other project that I'm doing, which takes us across the Arabian Sea to Western India. But I hope that gives us enough to chew on for now.
Thanks, Shireen. It's always, with reference also to listening to Aydogan before and yourself, it's always just such a pleasure and humbling experience to to um, to listen to your type of curiosity and to learn about another region in the world. And in fact, it's really at a personal level, that's just one of the great joys of working in a team that is, well, in this particular case, not so much multidisciplinary, although our broader team is multidisciplinary. It includes archaeologists as well. And my background in religion makes me feel very much at home when you and Aydogan speak, but just working trans-regionally. And that's just, yeah, super fun and rewarding. And I'm glad that we managed to do it. For my part, while I'm greatly benefiting from these sort of trans-regional either comparisons or evaluations of continuity and change, and I guess it's also worth saying, Shireen, that at this moment, our project is in its own way united by working within what we call a Galenic paradigm. So Galenism and what became in other parts of the world the Unani um, is a medical paradigm that was prevalent across much of Eurasia for the better part of 2,500 years. And so while it gained many interpretations and interacted with many other health and natural philosophical paradigms, it was something that was actually shared by a lot of, we would call it from Dublin to Delhi. It was there. It was there in the teaching books. It was there in the practices. It was there in the discourse. Even if was not exclusive or didn't mean the same thing everywhere. What I'm trying to do with so as I said before, I moved out of cities. I work mainly in Italian city-states with very rich archives. And I consciously sort of moved away outside the city walls and looked for a particular set of communities that are based out of the countryside. I worked on armies a little bit, but really I hit gold, if you'll excuse the pun, when I realized that mining communities that I knew nothing about 5 or 6 years ago are relatively well documented and predominantly rural, or at least originally rural communities, even if towns and sometimes even cities were built around the mining endeavor. And what this, I would say, it brought home many insights, but I think that one of the things that connects to what Shireen just said, or how she introduced us to her field of research, is the environment. So I think that urban historians like me really didn't think of ourselves, or often don't think of ourselves, as environmental historians, because we somehow tend to see, rightly or wrongly, cities as living in a way outside of the environment, capital E. Of course, they are environments, socio-economic and also material environments. But now I understand it differently, but it's thanks to working on miners who live in the countryside and face in their own way the raw dangers of working in the subsoil, but also of being occupying remote and sometimes often, sorry, inhospitable environments. High altitudes, scarce resources, prone to floods, prone to avalanches, depending on where you are, um, difficult to raise crops for their own sustenance, limited diets, and of course, beyond that, very hard work and very dangerous, risky work. So to me, that was part of going back to this issue of healthscaping. How did these communities, just like the ulema and just like people I hope Aydogan will talk about soon, how did they design environments where health could bloom, right? How did they understand, analyze, and intervene in the environments they occupied and shaped to improve their well-beings? And again, there's a whole range of so contrary to this 1,000 years of without a bath or apathy and ignorance about health, they did a lot of things to reduce the particular set of risks that they were exposed to. And you can imagine what those are for miners that didn't change until today. Flood, collapse, injury, again, scarcity of food, difficult conditions above the ground as well as under the ground. And they developed a lot of things from protective gear to anti-flooding devices to orientation devices under the ground. All of this is without electronics, without GPSs, without those kinds of material aids, as well as, and I think this is why one of the things that does bring us together mythologically, their religious attitudes, their pious attitudes towards that space, not only their bodies and their communities, but also the way in which they tried to maintain relationships with patron saints above the ground. And also something that is unique, I think, to my miners, but I'm happy to be informed, is, as Aydogan knows, because I shared a chapter with him about this, under the ground, a lot of these miners are cultivating relationships with supernatural beings that they don't necessarily worship, but they acknowledge their presence and their role in protecting miners under the ground. And that could be various kinds of spirits and hobgoblins and slightly friendlier faces and demons, all the way to Satan himself. And you can remember, and some of you may or may not know, but this is a period, 13th century, 14th century with Dante, in which hell is being spatialized as an underground, as a subsoil sort of space carved out by God to accommodate Satan, to contain Satan, as it were. And miners were literally digging their way closer and closer to hell, um, albeit for the benefit of humanity because of the resources that they were extracting, which we can talk about later, how good that was for the environment. But they're also risking their lives and their souls by engaging in this kind of work in the space that they were. So part of their own kind of hellscaping meant being nice to these kinds of supernatural beings in various ways, which I won't go into right now. I'd love to hear from Aydogan as well.
Thank you. Yeah, the supernatural plays an important role in my research as a medieval Islamicist as well. So yeah, in my project, I'm focusing on this very widespread and I think today still very popular literature called prophetic medicine. So this is a literature that emerged in 800s and it was collecting the sayings attributed to the prophet. Between you and me, I think around 80% of them are probably forgery, apparently. But the aim of this literature was to address issues related to medicine and health. Now, this literature is typically depicted in the field as Bedouin quackery or kind of Bedouin attack against the establishment of the kind of Greek-based science. So the argument goes that science was adapted into the Muslim world, and this prophetic medicine literature emerged as a kind of nativist, almost like a fundamentalist response to that external medical literature. So it tried to kind of harmonize the two, but at the same time, the emergence of prophetic medicine is seen as the triumph of religion against science. And this fits very well into the broader European stereotypes about Muslim history because prophetic medicine became popular in 1300s for various reasons. And 1300s is widely depicted in the literature broadly as the beginning of the decline, so-called decline of the Muslim world. So the argument goes that in 1300s, philosophy began to decline, science began to decline, so on and so forth. And that's a decline that continues until the 1900s, so kind of 800 years of continuous decline. As I work on this prophetic medicine literature, I was able to uncover texts, so a couple dozen texts that people have not studied so far. And I tried to pay kind of close attention to these texts that are otherwise seen as pseudo-scientific or kind of fundamentalist or repetitive ways of kind of adding prophetic sayings related to medicine. And what I have discovered, in fact, is that prophetic medicine was not, it didn't in fact have anything anti-scientific or anti-medical or even anti-philosophical until 1300s, basically. So I kind of reject the hypothesis that prophetic medicine is a literature that is developing some kind of religious fervor against a kind of foreign science. And a second thing that I discovered, hopefully make clear with the newly discovered works, to show that the rise of prophetic medicine was an indicator of the popularization of medicine rather than it's becoming more marginal. And I do that through a study of the fields that I have been talking to a lot with Shireen in particular, through sound studies or to study of soundscapes. Prophetic medicine books were recited in public, unlike the Book of Avicenna or other famous philosophical books. And those books being recited were heard sometimes by hundreds of people, including children, women, people from different ethnic, religious, and of course, economic backgrounds. So I hope to show that compared to the 1200s, when you come to the 1300s, a regular city dweller in a Muslim majority world would be likely much more familiar than with Avicennan ideas compared to the 1200s, thanks to the rise of prophetic medicine. So the aim of the prophetic medicine was actually a form of internalizing the scientific language into the broader public. And my hope is, as I mentioned, is to use this literature to go against this kind of broad decline paradigms, which have been rejected widely in the field. But I think still in the broader sense, especially in comparative studies, I still see that used. Hopefully, I will be kind of arguing that this decline paradigm is not actually working at all. Rather, what we see is the increased contribution of different agents in the Muslim world into the existing medical paradigm. Excellent. So with those, introduction to our works, I think that some themes that are related to decolonization already emerged, obviously. But I want to maybe ask more specifically to you both. I would say, beyond the knowledge that you discover and beyond the ideas that relate to the history that you kind of introduce in your research, how does your research specifically relate or specifically help us to decolonize our understandings of public health? Can you be maybe giving us a couple of one example, for example, to make it much easier to understand? Because I would highly appreciate that. And maybe we can begin with Shireen, if you like.
Sure, thank you. So one example that I will give is about this second article that I'm writing with this group, which is allowing me to go deeper into an interest I have in stepwells. And so and in bathing and waterside spaces in general. I'm sorry, I don't know if that police siren is
Oh, no, we
coming
don't
into
hear
the
it.
sound.
Don't
Okay.
worry. Yeah.
Cool. It's filtered out then. Yeah, so uh these are some stepwells for those who have never heard of them before, and that could be many people, are very massive, oftentimes very massive and very deep structures that extend into the earth, sometimes 3 feet, sometimes as much as 9 feet. Sorry, not 3 feet, 3 stories, sometimes as much as 9 stories. They are very unique to in the specific structure that I'm talking about. There are many water structures across South Asia, but these specific stepwells, they are unique to the western parts of India that I showed you guys on the map earlier. They are really beautiful, ornate, carved out of stone. And what they did basically was in a region that was extremely arid, that was extremely has basically only receives rainfall in the monsoons. These places became uh, structures that could not only provide access to water as the water level dropped, right, over time, and people had to go deeper and deeper into the step well to access the water. This was groundwater. But it also, as was recently pointed out to me, these structures recharge the groundwater. Because if it did rain, especially in the rainy season in the monsoons, then then the rain was able to, be collected by the step wells. And we may think of these things as dots on a map, right? If I were to show you dots on a map of where these all are, but really they show the interconnection of groundwater underneath, an invisible sort of network, the way that these things all flow into each other. And so I should definitely show at least one picture because I'm sort of teasing you all with a description. But the reason I think this relates to decolonization is not just only the kind of initial issue of look at this amazing indigenous technology that's so well adapted to our environment, to the environment of this place, right? That was then destroyed by colonialism, because the British, when they arrived in South Asia, they really didn't like this structure and this way of sorry, let me just try to focus this here down to the slide. Are these photographs visible now?
Yes, very much. Thank you.
Wonderful. So, the British didn't like these structures as sources of water. They wanted water to be centralized, and they completely changed the way that water is distributed in South Asia. This is kind of a history, a historian of architecture's cross section of that. So if you're on the ground, you just see these long pillars, stone pillars running flat to the ground, and these pavilions rising above. But once you enter, you're in this kind of cavernous structure where you can descend down to the source of groundwater at the bottom. And if it's the rainy season, potentially this entire structure could be full of water. If not, you may have to go quite low. Today, because of the reduction of the water table due to many factors, including again the shift in how water is used, but also the way cities are dealing with pumping water and reducing the water tables, you just have a little bit of water at the ground now, and it's not maintained as a place that people could drink at. And so, yes, it's this ingenious, technology that was destroyed essentially by a massive colonial project that was even furthered by post-independence, by nationalism, with the creation of dams and other kind of temples of modernity, as Nehru called them, right? Um, but I think in addition to that, our project calls for us to really think differently about how people inhabited such a structure. So this is a picture from within the structure. This is a picture on the left. You see a picture going, you're at the top and you're going down into it. And then very shortly after that, within a minute, I took this picture. These are from Ahmedabad, the current capital of Gujarat, in Western India. And so you can see how much light there is and how I can tell you how much heat there was standing here. I descended just 2 stories into it and took this photo, and it was so cool. It was so moist. It was a different environment. We could call it a microclimate. And so it's tempting to just think of it in these material terms because it's such an astounding structure. But I think a decolonial approach actually requires us to go deeper than that, to try and center um, and value the reasons that the structure would have been valued in this context. And part of that requires us to pay attention to Galenic medicine and the intense importance of heating and cooling the body. And part of it requires us to pay attention to religion and the immense significance of water across the multiple religious traditions that would have been practiced and lived by people in this space. And so that I think is just one example that I'll share for now.
Oh, it's a wonderful example. Thank you, dear Shireen. As you were talking, I think I just took a look at the report written by Francesca Albanese, on what's happening in Palestine. So she wrote the following, which I guess very much relates to what you said. She says, there's an inherent conflict exists between the colonizers who seek to acquire and control the land and indigenous population for whom the land is integral to their identity. Where they are is who they are. And this connection from the land, cultural roots contributes to the erosion of identity, community resilience, resulting in physically destructive outcomes, poorer health, lower life expectancy, abnormally high suicide rates, as we have seen in Australia too, obviously. The issue of land is therefore indicative of how the settler colonial project destroys in order to replace the indigenous population. And the example that you give is, I guess, a very good example of not a settler colonialism, but the broader franchise colonialism's way of distracting, I guess, the health infrastructure. So thank you for that. What about you, dear Guy?
Yeah, very much building on and very much building on Shireen's example. I would just want to point out maybe 2 or 3 things that, as a project, we're consciously seeing as an intervention in a decolonizing project, intellectually speaking, at least. One, and just to spell out the obvious, Shireen's pretty much engaged it. What Gayatri Spivak calls epistemic violence, very famously the project of modernity, of colonization. So it doesn't have to be just colonization. It can just be the project of modernity that it's trying to efface earlier things. So the violence can be epistemic, or what David Arnold called colonization of the body, which was specifically coined in the Indian context, but can easily be tested, at least in other contexts as well. So what we're trying to do is develop an understanding, a grounded historical understanding of what people in earlier pre-modern, pre-colonial societies meant by healthscaping. So again, as I said at the beginning, how they defined health and how they pursued it, and that's why it's in the title of the project, the pursuit of health, because I hope I don't need to convince anyone. We're only trying. The success is whether you measure it in biometrical, in biomedical terms, and whatever metric you're using to assess. We sometimes succeed, and a lot of times we fail. And sometimes when we succeed in one thing, we fail in another things, right? Differences between vertical and horizontal interventions, as you know, can be devastating. So, but the important thing is to understand, to trace continuities as well as change between community health in different contexts, especially before the colonial project or imperialism or modernity, because there's often the assumption, again, 1,000 years without a bath, is that colonization basically improved people's outcome. Even if it was originally for the colonists or their armies, eventually there was a trickle-down process which benefited all indigenous populations everywhere. Now we can critique that, and of course, in many senses, it's wrong or it's unhistorical. But I think that the counterpart to it, or the burden of proof, needs to be on us as historians, especially of pre-modern, pre-colonial, pre-encounter historians, to actually document what people did and to connect it to medical or well-being paradigms, whether they're spiritual, material, physical, doesn't matter right now. What matters is to sort of resurrect that kind of voice or those kinds of interventions in the environment that people at the time thought were benefiting their health. And that's what the entire project is trying to do, to amass evidence that will make it unavoidable for our fellow modern public health medical historians to ignore what came earlier. Even as they are very critical of colonial interventions, they often actually don't know what's happened in the past. So our contribution to the scholarship on this is to say, hey, you know, here is what people engage with intellectually, materially, spiritually when they tried to improve their health, when, armies landed, when a state was built, when conquest was perpetrated. I just think that a lot of people don't know what's happened before. And that leads me to the second point. They don't know because they're looking in the wrong place. Even if they're looking, most of them aren't looking. They just assume that whatever violence was perpetrated on an otherwise apathetic population when it came to health. So we're trying to get rid of that. But how do we actually establish that? And this is where I think we can learn carefully and critically, extrapolating from some of the European experiences. So I'm very much aware that we're trying to undermine Eurocentrism here. Methodologically, to sort of say, what can healthscaping be? What are the sources that can inform us about how people defined and pursued health as communities can come from a range of different sources. And I think that a lot of public health and medical historians, when they look into the past, they have a bit of an intellectualist bias. So they are looking for, or they are Eurocentric in their approach. So they're looking for medical texts that Aydogan was talking about, or certain structures or certain forms of clinical interventions that either were not there or did not survive in terms of documentation. So rather than say, oh, because these don't exist, they weren't interested in health, which I hope you agree with me is a problematic hypothesis or conclusion, what we're trying to do is expand the range of approaches to be a lot more inclusive. And here we're looking at, we're looking at music, we're looking at ephemeral evidence, folklore, religious ritual, prayers, all the way to medical interventions, but also spatial interventions from wells to walls to orientation services and things like that, which we use to test the hypothesis that they did know how to define, how that they had tools to define health and how they used it, rather than evaluate the success or failure of those measures in modern biomedical terms. So again, the intervention is both historical and methodological, and all of it collectively resists, and I'll conclude with this, with the so-called ameliorative narrative of modernity, right? So that if it's, earlier is worse, later is better, that we're constantly improving. And I think that I hope that I'm preaching to the choir here in the sense that we're creating problems as we solve others. It's not like we're all constantly the global modern capitalism, imperialism, colonialism solved these problems. They solved some problems. They introduced a lot of others, and that is probably where I'll leave it.
Absolutely. Sounds wonderful. Thank you very much. And we have like 5 minutes, and it would be wonderful to hear from our colleagues as well. I see Mridula raise her hand, which is wonderful. Our colleague from the School of Social Sciences. Eileen, as far as I read from the chat, is also a public health practitioner, so working on upper GI cancer clinical quality registries, which is wonderful. So it would be great to hear from them too. My 1 minute summary about why my work might actually relate to decolonization is I think I will set the bar much lower than what you have. I think we are right now living in a world where there is magnificent dehumanization of the populations that I'm studying, like the Arabs, basically, as if you are looking at the news, right? So including health workers, right? So more than 400 health workers have been killed over the last 1.5 years. You might have heard that just last week, basically, 15 medical workers were killed. They were buried with the ambulances. I think there is this, within this context, I guess, even studies on Arabs, I guess, in many ways reminding us that they are part of humanity as well. So it's a very low bar, but I guess in many ways, even the field of Islamic studies is, I think, important. You might have seen that the Center for Middle East at Harvard University had 2 heads, and they were removed from their positions. And these departments are their funding cut by the American president, and they are just pushing agendas to even basically the production of knowledge on Islam and Muslims is even apparently a threat in the world that we are living in. I guess that might be why maybe my work might be a little bit helpful in humanizing Arabs once again. But with that, I will leave the floor to our guests. Dear Muridullah, would you like to have anything to add or questions, comments? Very welcome.
I'm coming from literature, so I'm the School of Languages, Literatures, Cultures, and Linguistics.
Yeah, sorry, apologies for that.
That's
Yeah.
okay. Just fascinating panel, and just looking at the ways in which the intrusions upon methods around health, what you're calling healthscapes. I just have a quick comment. I'm struck by how architecture has played such an important role. If you think of hammams and if you think of the stepwells, the beauty in these health giving spaces, so to speak, has to be an element certainly in improving some kind of idea of health, just going to the hammam or going to the stepwells. So I'm wondering if any of you have thought about that angle yet, because I'm coming as a complete novice to this space.
Well, both Guy and Shireen have a lot to talk about, I'm sure. We can start with you, dear Shireen, if you like.
I think beauty was absolutely very relevant to health, and I think Aydogan is being humble, and there's a lot in the prophetic tradition about that as well. But I will say that in addition to that, it kind of makes me more aware in my work about access. So, which hammams were beautiful and who had access to them, and which stepwells were ornate and who had access to them versus which were not. and also the labor. And so it's also kind of to say that, though it is, I do believe that it is decolonial to approach work that can affect communities, as Aydogan is saying, can be done with communities. And on regions where knowledge is seen to have not existed or to have been inferior, it also is important for us to think about the hierarchies that were present in that space and not to idealize them. And both the hammam and the stepwell and the labor that was associated with them and the kind of like polluting aspect um, of touching water that had been used to bathe, and the kind of stigma that was associated with that. It has become clear to me in the research. So it is both, these are institutions we have a lot to learn from, but also they weren't perfect and it isn't enough just to study the history, I feel.
Dear Guy, do you have anything to add?
Well, in a nutshell, Merdula, and thank you for the question. I think that there is a lot to be said about the connection between beauty and health. And certainly, if I put my hat on back on of the urban historian, a lot of the cities that I and my colleagues have worked on, their statutes, their policies made explicit connections between the beauty and the health of the city, so that the splendor and the beauty of the city are a reflection of the healthy environment, and in turn, making the environment more healthy for the complicated populations that occupy it. But your question did sensitize me in a different way to the fact that as I move into the countryside, my minors do not talk about beauty at all. They somehow, I think that the discussion shifts to creation and nature, which can, of course, be very beautiful, but it's more about the integrity of the landscape that is being deteriorated. So I think it's an interesting distinction that I would make, at least in my research. But it's absolutely, I think, when we go back to definitions or cosmological discussions, beauty, integrity, and health and sustenance and stability and all of those things are kind of part of a similar semantic range. So I think it's a very good point.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your contribution as well, dear Mirdula. I think with that, we can wrap up the panel. So yeah, thank you very much, dear Guy and dear Shireen and dear participant like Mirdula for joining us. It's been my honor to work with Guy and Shireen, and of course with Mirdula in other occasions as well. So yeah, thank you very much once again for joining our panel, and I wish you best of luck in concluding your projects, dear Guy and Shireen.
Thank
Thank
you
you
very
very
much.
much, Aydogan. Thank you,
Thank you.
Merdula, and everyone for
Take care of
joining.
yourselves, everyone. See you. Bye-bye.